Thanks, Don. And I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay. If you can't, or if my audio starts to break up, put it in the chat window and I'll try to speak louder. Um, so the first thing I was going to talk about, and actually I'll give you 2 seconds on my background. I started developing content back in the late 70s on a mainframe system called Plato. Did that for many years. In 93, I started my own company that grew, and through a series of events, became part of SuccessFactors. So as I'm giving this presentation, there's some things that I always ask people to think about because they're kind of questions that we're going to wind up answering. First question is, are your learners enthusiastic about taking training? Particularly here in the States, a lot of times when people are assigned training, they dread it. Good question is why? How much time do people actually spend in content versus the management system? What makes high quality instruction? And basically, we're going to start now. So one of the mistakes that companies always make is that they assume that anybody can create good content. I'm going to go into detail why this is a huge mistake. Another mistake that vendors make all the time is that that they can create good content. And I'm going to talk about this in a lot of detail. So I always start with, what does it take to actually make good, solid content? And what I mean by good content is material that when someone takes it, they're not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be entertaining, but it has to be something that when they come away from it, they've learned what you want them to learn. There's been an approach called Addy that has been around forever. And what I'm going to do, and this is way, way before e-learning or the internet or anything. It was something that people always used when creating, whether it be text-based material or classroom material. And it's still applicable. Doesn't matter the medium. Steps are analysis. We define what it is that you need to teach. You design it, which is the first D. You develop it, which is the actual creation process. You implement it, which is obviously very important. And then the last step that everybody misses is the evaluation piece, which is you measure the results or the effectiveness of your content. So let's talk about analysis for a little bit here, because this is an area where lots of people make mistakes. One of the things that companies do is they say, oh, we need an HR course, or we need a course on safety, or we need, just something, and it's a very, very general topic. But they don't take the time to actually look at the individuals who are supposed to get it, what their background is, or what they want as a result of it. So some of the questions that when I go and visit companies that I'm always trying to ask them is, what are the problems that they're trying to solve through this training? And more times than not, they tell me the title, but they don't actually tell me the problem that they were trying to solve because they hadn't thought about it. Something else is how much do these problems actually cost the company? Not the training, but the problems that they're trying to address. And one of the problems that companies have is when they're calculating ROI, they're not looking at what the problem actually costs the company. And that's usually one of the biggest parts of ROI. Something that's obvious is how long and how much will it cost to develop the training. And this is where people usually begin to take shortcuts. And then the last part that people miss is how they can measure the effectiveness of it. And this is right up front, what I say, or what I call planning the evaluation. How do you know that you actually did something and that it was worth doing? So training departments often overlook the corporate data warehouse or any type of corporate overview information as a source of where they need to do training. The second thing that they also overlook is measuring the impact on the business and using that as part of their ROI calculation. And I've got a great example of this at the end. So most companies wind up, or what they should be doing, is they should be using what's typically called their learning management system inside the company. Unfortunately, a lot of companies wind up using the learning management simply to launch and track the content. What they're missing is if it's been implemented properly, they can determine what needs to be taught, who it needs to be taught to, and what the impact on the business should be after the people have taken, or after the employees have taken the content. The next piece of this is designing it. When I go and talk to companies, especially ones that have that are doing the in-house development, people tend to spend too much time on the aesthetics of the content. And there's no question that screen design is important, but at the end of the day, you can get away with something that's pretty ugly. I mean, face it, black text on a white piece of paper isn't the most attractive thing to read from, but it is probably one of the easiest things to read from. So one of the things that I always emphasize for people is this idea of spending enough time and actually working on the instructional design. And I'll get into what that means a little bit. One of the things, or another thing that people always forget about this medium, which I absolutely love about it, is that unlike classroom or textbook or video, is that it really can be engaging, and that you have the option of having the person do something instead of just being passive and watching or listening to something. What do I mean by this? So here's a good example, and this is something everybody has to go through, and usually it's painful, which is IT training. And I like this example because I had to go through this not too long ago, which is you get a question about, say, email security, and what I've seen in most of the content is something where you get a question, and then you'll get a multiple choice, and you're supposed to click on the link in the email, or pick which ones of these are right. And it's sometimes they do a select one or select many. You could arrange the exact same thing as a image of what the company's email, in this case this is an exchange interface, and I apologize for the graphic being kind of stretched out of shape. But the point here is that you can ask the person to actually click on what the right button or what the right action is. Because as we all know as instructional designers, it's one thing to be able to read something or listen to something, then pick the correct answer out of the list. It's another thing to be able to apply the knowledge. So what I like about this example is that the first one doesn't actually test that the person can identify whether an email is fraudulent or not. It only shows that they can recognize the correct answer. Both interactions are multiple choice. So at the end of the day, they take about the same amount of time to develop. Yeah, it's going to take you a couple minutes to do a screenshot, but really, you're asking the same question, using the same type of interaction, but one way really tests whether or not someone can make the correct selection. So like I said, they both take about the same time to create. And then what I always tell people when they're building their own content, that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then an interaction is worth 10,000 words. And it doesn't matter if, some people say, oh, IT training is boring, or, accounting is boring, and you can't really have, interactions. And I've yet to find someone that can give me something that I can't build an interaction out of. throughout our daily lives or anything that anybody wants to do, we are interacting and we're having to apply what we know. I'll talk to some other examples at the end. People always say, well, I've got to develop low bandwidth or instruction. It's over, a very small piece of equipment or, actually people are rarely dialed in these days. But way back when, there was, this is a screenshot of an example that I loved, and this is for kids, and kids would play with this forever. And what they would do is they would click on the different words to make a sentence. So they could say, the car jumped over the dog to the house. And there's a row of text at the bottom that's cut off. But at the end, if the learner did this properly, they would get to see what they had clicked on, and it would animate it. And if they didn't do it properly, it told them that it wasn't a complete sentence or that the grammar was incorrect or something. And what I loved about this example was that it's very, very simple. It's one interaction, and kids literally would play with this for hours. And you really did learn, how to create a proper sentence, and you learned, you got to see the results of it. I wouldn't call it a game, but, as kids, we were always diagramming sentences in school and doing silly exercises. Well, this was a great use of, we called it computer-based training back then. And it was something that you couldn't do in a classroom. You couldn't do it in a video. You couldn't do it in a textbook, but it was something that a computer brought to the learning process that was really, really valuable. So when I go and I look at different people's content, they have, or a lot of companies put in interactions that make no sense. One of my favorites, and I literally saw this, was click the rabbit to continue. And this was for a piece of adult training. And I call these bad interactions because what they're doing is they're forcing the learner to do something unnatural just for the sake of progressing. And it doesn't add to the learning experience, and a lot of times it can be thought of as almost demeaning for the learner. So some of the things that I consider bad interactions are things like asking a student to perform some action that makes no sense whatsoever. Another is confusing navigation with knowledge, where you'll ask someone to click on something on the screen just to identify it as a way of navigating. When you're developing content, you don't want to mix up, and this is a mistake people make, is they mix up navigation with answering a question. And then, we see people who essentially use interactivity incorrectly, just on a wide range of things, where they have you click and drag things that don't make sense. And I really don't like, matching type interactions just in general, because they're essentially a multiple choice. And often, like, we did work for utility companies, we've done work for airlines, and these individuals, you don't want to have them spend time learning how to operate the interaction. You want them to spend time learning learning the content itself. So let's talk about off-the-shelf content. I always joke and say sometimes the most well-written piece of off-the-shelf content is the course description itself. One of the things individuals often do is they buy content without actually looking at it. They read the description. And the descriptions, in most cases, cover such a broad topic that they would be appropriate for anybody, for anything. But you really, when you buy off-the-shelf content, you actually need to go through the content and see that it's teaching what it is that you want to teach. So make sure it's, that the instruction is good and it's actually teaching what you want to be taught. a mistake that's often made is they assume that bigger content companies produce better quality. Often the smaller niche companies have better instruction, or they go into the subject in way more detail. So don't get locked into the idea that, oh, this is XYZ vendor, they've got every title under the sun. You may actually, and this is a great thing about e-learning, is that you can pick and mix and match content from multiple vendors. And just because it's there doesn't mean someone will use it or benefit from it. I've visited hundreds of companies that bought entire libraries of content, put them out there for employees to use, and they never get touched. This is something that your LMS can actually tell you what the usage is of the content. So what about free content? And I love this example. Not all free content is good. Not all free content is bad. A lot of the stuff, and just like with off-the-shelf content, a lot of the stuff you actually have to go and make sure it makes sense. This is a YouTube video that was passed off as a piece of instruction, and it always cracked me up because it's a video on how to unlock your car using a tennis ball. And to be honest, if this was true, every car thief in the world would be using tennis balls to unlock cars. But it's a very convincing piece of content, and it really makes you believe that you could do it. So what I like to say is not all free content is bad. Not all of it is relevant, meaning that just because it's out there and it may say that it teaches to a topic, it's not particularly instructional or maybe incorrect altogether. I always say none of it's really free because when you're out there just looking for stuff, you really are going to spend a lot of time going through and finding something that actually teaches what you want to get, what you want to teach. So you are going to spend time, and that amount of time varies wildly. And depending on what you're trying to teach, you may have been better off just creating a piece of content yourself. There are some great things. Khan Academy is fantastic. But even Khan Academy, like I said, it's free. So you have to make sure that it's relevant to your needs. One of the things about Khan Academy is it started out for academic instruction, and which there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But for a lot of businesses, it's more training than it is learning that they're trying to accomplish. And a lot of the stuff on the Khan Academy site is theoretical, which is perfectly good. And like I know a lot of companies that use the finance or accounting type material, and it works great for them. Some of the complaints that people have is that it's not specific enough. It really is at a very, very high level. So we get that going back and forth about, well, I just want an overview for my employees. And then usually, if you're talking about something more technical, people want to say, no, we want you to know A, B, C, D, E, which is why the whole analysis piece of Addy is so important. The fact that it's video, everybody's got their own, all right, if I want to watch video, I could watch it anywhere, it's great, or video isn't interactive, so, I don't want to use that. And people debate whether or not that's a good medium or not. And personally, I believe video is perfectly acceptable for lots of things, but if you're trying to teach, something that's a process or something that you can actually have the person practice, you're losing a lot of the benefit for the learner if you're just using video. Next, we'll talk about deployment real quick. And I always ask people to think about this. Which is more frustrating for a learner? Taking poor quality content or taking irrelevant content? And think about this for a minute, because I see both of these things happening. People have PowerPoints that, we're supposed to have a presentation, or maybe they're narrated, and they take it and they're not engaged and they dread taking it, or they get assigned something that really has no relevance to their job whatsoever, and they scratch their head wondering, why the hell am I taking this? I usually say that both of them are bad. I mean, you want to stay away from both of these things because, irrelevant content really makes the learner frustrated, and it makes them question what their job is about, or whether you understand what their job is about, and it's really, really frustrating. The thing that a lot of companies miss is what's the cost of assigning people irrelevant content. And it's more than just the learner's time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It really is expensive. And this is a piece that I've seen wide varieties of things happen with this, which is credibility of your training or learning department. And this goes back to the question I asked right up front, which is, are your learners enthusiastic about taking training, or, taking e-learning, or, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of this builds or works for or against the credibility of your training department. If you're providing stuff that's meaningful and it's relevant for an individual, even if it's not the prettiest stuff in the world, if they come away from it thinking, wow, I actually learned something and this was interesting, then it works really, really well. People rarely, or I shouldn't say rarely, but less often than they should, use the tools that they have and they spend a lot of money on for managing things like the deployment and deciding who should take the content, when, and what the goals are. A lot of times it's just blanket assignments. If you're not using your LMS for this, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle, or a huge amount of the value of why you bought an LMS. I've got some good examples of this that I'll talk through. In fact, this is one of them. So we had a customer who basically went through kind of, I reworded Addy here, went through this process over and over of identifying problems that cost the company a lot of money, figuring out whether or not they could be resolved through training, developing content that addressed those problems specifically, delivered it to a segment of the population, measured the impact, and then went back to management and showed them all of the data. So how does this work? So here's one of our examples, and this is for a major airline. We had a maintenance manager, not even someone who was in the training department, but someone who was in charge of making sure all the maintenance crews that went out and did work on airplanes, figured this out. So what he did is he went through every month the company would list the reasons for flight cancellations. He went through and identified the top 10 reasons that he could address through training that were reasons for flight cancellations. And then, okay, so I actually missed a slide there. So he figured out which problems he could address. And then he developed training that targeted the mistakes that those maintenance engineers were making. He delivered the training to those specific individuals at a couple locations. So in this case, he did one in Tokyo, he did one in Minneapolis, and he did one in somewhere in Europe, and I forgot where. But this airline had maintenance centers all around the world. At the end of about 90 days, he went and he looked at the 3 months worth of flight cancellations. And what he was able to do is show that what used to be for the previous who knows how many years, they had an average number of flight cancellations due to these problems. At these 4 airports, what used to be in the top 10 problems didn't even show up in the list of top 100. At all of the other airports where the individuals didn't receive the training, the problems still occurred. They dropped down a little bit just because planes weren't landing and having those issues come up. But he went back to the the management and basically had his training budget doubled, because every flight cancellation doesn't just cost the tickets or of the individuals who were supposed to be on it, but it's every other flight down the chain that plane was supposed to carry. So any given flight cancellation was millions of dollars. Because it costs extra fuel to get another plane to pick up passengers that were down the line, at other airports and everything else. So this is just a really, really simple example, and it was done by someone who wasn't actually very high up in the company, but it was something that it was looking at the company data, using to identify a problem, using the LMS to figure out the individuals who needed this additional training, figuring out what that training was, delivering it, and then measuring the results. So last piece, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, is what does it actually take to do this kind of thing? And this is also where companies make big mistakes. So you have to ask yourself, would you have the people who are creating your content today write a book? Would you have them create and direct a video? Would you have them work in your IT department? Would you have them work in your graphics department? Or would you even have them be a classroom instructor? And the reason I ask you to think about this is because all of these other mediums are far simpler than developing computer-based instruction, e-learning, whatever you want to call it. And the skill sets required really are a combination of all of these. And one of the things that I always tell people is that in a lot of cases, SMEs, or subject matter experts, are actually not good instructors. Some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. In fact, I would say the majority of them aren't good instructors. They've been working in a factory, they've been working behind a desk, they've been doing everything but teaching. Not every instructor is a good designer. When you have someone who can stand up in front of a class and present material, they may know the material. They may know how to stand up in front of the class and present it, but it doesn't mean they can actually write it or design a piece of instruction. Not every designer is a good author. It's one skill set to be able to write a book or organize information in a way that it makes sense to present it and, get the point across and make sure everybody can understand the material the way you want them to and how to make a point. But it's something very, very different to actually create the content in e-learning, or, to use Flash, or to use even PowerPoints. I've seen instructors who make the world's worst PowerPoints, a dozen different fonts, horrendous clip art, everything. Another great overlap that I see is not every author is a good graphic designer, and it kind of goes on and on like this. But in the end, what you need, if you're doing this stuff in-house, or if you're going out of house and you're hiring a country to develop content for you, is that you really need to make sure that you have an individual or collection of individuals who have these skill sets. It's not important that everybody is, the absolute best, but of this group, I would say by far, the two most important people are the SME, meaning someone who really understands the material, and the author, the person who's writing the material. Because even if it's a page turner, if it's well written, someone can gain from it. But you could have the most beautiful content with the best graphics and incredible video that doesn't teach anything. And we see a lot of content that wins awards that really, really doesn't teach a whole lot. So my thoughts on this, and I always tell people, hey, you can take, this is just my thoughts. But if your company's serious about doing it, do it right. Not everyone has every skill, and as part of a company, if you can identify great training, but you don't have artists or other people, use that skill set to find good training. Don't try and build it in-house. Another mistake companies don't make is prioritize your training. There are problems that are costing your company money, and that's almost always the best way to rank what titles you deliver first. If you're being fined or if people are getting hurt, that is usually the most expensive thing. A lot of times things like, I don't want to say safety, but courses revolving around political correctness don't necessarily cost the company a lot of money. The ROI is much lower. And often companies buy content and they don't know why they're buying it. It's not actually addressing a problem that costs the company money. Which comes to my last point, which is basically any piece of training you ask someone to take, you should be able to measure the results of it on the business. You should be able to see the results. It's very, very rare. And even if it's something that's just changing the culture of the business, you should know why you're sending it to people and why you're asking them to spend the time to take it. And I believe, actually, Don, this is different deck, but it's okay.
No, that's okay. Ed, I think we're good, actually. We've got, and I agree, Con says, hooray for Ed, great points. And there are great points there, absolutely. If you wanted to carry on a short while, we've got about 5 minutes of content time if you wish.
Okay. Well, these next slides are more about SuccessFactors. And actually, there's this very next slide I'll talk about for a second here. There is something that I coined the term content about it's been probably 10 years now. And thing that both the e-learning standards are beginning to address. I'm sure everyone has heard about Tin Can, SCORM, with CMI5, what the AICC is doing. And this is something that's really interesting. And I actually think this is the vendors are beginning to catch up, which is there's a big difference between simply buying store content hosted versus having content that is a lot of content has a structural objectives. Everything is indexed from a number of vendors that you can essentially buy or lease or use and mix and match, and they all tie into whatever system it is that you're using to launch it. And then, another piece on top of that is having an authoring tool that automatically publishes to essentially that same method. So it's kind of like an IT approach to e-learning across multiple vendors. And it's something maybe 2 or 3 at most
Ed,
that are... I'm sorry.
Ed, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got a number of people making a comment that the sound suddenly got very choppy, and I've noticed that as well. It sounds, as Jonathan, as if you're vanishing down a deep well, which is a very dramatic way of putting it. I don't know if it's that. I think it's because you use a VoIP dial-in that we've got choppy VoIP, we've got conflicts for VoIP at your end, or perhaps extra demand. Let me ask you a question. So let's switch over to Q&A now. Let me ask you some questions, and then if you can answer them, that'll be great. If we still have choppy audio when you're answering them, perhaps we'd have to find some other way of dialing in.
Does this sound better now?
This does sound better.
I moved my microphone. I'm sorry. I apologize. And I think that's what happened.
How extraordinary. we've probably reached the point, nonetheless, where we do have to get to Q&A anyway. So let's go back to the SuccessFactors slide so everyone can remember the name of the company. That's not a bad idea, is it? And then let me pitch in with some questions that were brought up earlier on. Thanks. First question I've got coming up is from Henry Fuller, and I always keep a track of the questions so that they are, it's just not the people who are most recent that get to answer the questions, but those that were raised earlier on are asked as well. Henry Fuller asked, right at the beginning, with the very simple game, with the child using a text tool to create sentences, fine for kids, but can a game as simple as that still have learning benefits for adults? What do you think? Do you think it can, Ed?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, in the 90s, I developed an adult literacy course, and I actually mimicked that interaction in that game for adults. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the game Jeopardy. It's a tip here. And one of the things that was interesting was that actually is the most popular game show for adults who are illiterate. So we essentially mimicked the game that I showed you and did a Jeopardy-style version of it, where they got to answer questions relevant to applying for jobs, using mass transit, issues that were for adults, and put them together in a way, similar interaction as to what was done with that game.
Okay. And I do think that if we've got, everyone can find things compelling, and it's a matter of finding what they find compelling and latching onto that to make sure that we make the most of it, rather than trying to create the content and then find the solution it's trying to solve, which is all too often, I think, an error that people fall into. And brings us to the next question, raised a bit of an issue. Andrew, I'll come back to your point about aesthetics later on. I think that's an interesting point. But Neil W. said, I don't know of anybody developing, delivering, or receiving irrelevant content. How much of a problem is this? Has anybody else experienced this? And Con from Australia said, I agree. I don't know very many people in that category. Whereas Valerie said, well, actually, no, I've had to undertake mandatory fire training for hospital wards. I don't work in a hospital ward. I rarely go to the wards. It's irrelevant, but I had to do it. Now, perhaps this is a semantic question. Is some of the content being developed irrelevant or perhaps less useful than other content? But still, how much of an issue do you think it is that there is irrelevant or less useful content being developed out there? Ed?
It's actually, at least for the companies that I go visit, companies often blanketly assign content to the entire company. Even if, and the fire training is a good example, there may be safety training, there may be other stuff that just has nothing to do with that individual's job. And so the missed topic or incorrect topic is one way things are irrelevant. Another way things are irrelevant is that they're too generic, meaning it's a course on a particular topic, but it's so generic because it's off-the-shelf content that they don't actually learn something from it. And it's just to check a box, that's part of a regulation or something that someone has to take this. But it doesn't really apply to their company or their company culture. So irrelevant can be either a topic that's not relevant for that individual, or the depth of the content, meaning it's so general that it has nothing to do with their job. So yeah, it actually is. It's a big issue here in the States for a lot of businesses.
And in the UK, Kate says it's endemic, unfortunately. But I don't want to suggest that Neil's asked an irrelevant question. I think it's an important question. And I want to thank you for asking it, Neil, because I think this is something which anybody who's involved in L&D needs to ask themselves, which is how much is what I'm producing geared around what the business needs? And I'll ask you a question about the airline example in a minute. And how much is it geared around what I am used to doing and what I am comfortable doing? And part of that, of course, is this process that Ed outlined early on about the conversational engagement with the people who have the problems. Now, to come back to your point about the airport, just want to check. You did actually, when the gentleman introduced the training to reduce the top 10 causes of flight delays, he did check against, as a control group, airports where the training hadn't taken place, and found that as a baseline that had moved downwards a little, but far less than where the training took place. Is that right?
Absolutely. And that was and since that example, I've seen other individuals do something similar in the automotive industry. It basically, way back when, there was this thing called statistical process control, which is used in a lot of manufacturing, where it's this constant process of looking at the output and determining, what types of mistakes there are, and then going back, addressing them, and then, measuring the results of it. That's all he did. This wasn't something new.
Yeah.
And I would say there's probably, in every major company, a dozen people who are either trying to do this or who do this on a regular basis.
And we're not saying that the other training was irrelevant, but by goodness, this training saved a bunch of money. Another example, company in the States, well, actually it's a Chinese-based company, TTI, but in the States, they looked at, again, the 10 reasons. In this case, the 10 reasons why returned goods were being handled badly. They managed to drop the return rate from a 4% return rate to a 1.8% return rate, which saved the company something in the region of $30 million. Process control. Just find out what's going wrong and fix it. Andrew Hyde says, Ed, you suggested that aesthetics weren't very important, but surely this is the product packaging that will attract users to dive in. I think, hasn't Andrew got a point? We need to at least make things look good. Nobody wants to dance with the ugly person at the ball.
So I always joke, when was the last time you picked up a great novel and beautifully laid out on a page?
I tell you what, can I chip in there? My wife, who's a publisher, will say, nobody ever notices it when it's done right. But when it's done wrong, everybody will tell you it doesn't look right, even if they can't say why. But bad layout always shows up. Sorry to interrupt you.
Right. So this is the thing. There is, there's a downside to not having stuff. Like my example of PowerPoints that use a dozen different fonts and everything. You want something that difficult to read or difficult. So from that perspective, but the amount of emphasis on is sometimes goes. It does from the instruction, but if you're trying to do something in-house and you have a choice of spending an extra option versus you are for a custom made piece of graphic, I would say go for the clip art, spend the time on the instruction, because at the end of the day, unless it's a graphic that's a technical diagram that's trying to show something that's really, really important, you're trying to keep someone, and it's the instructional piece that is going to hold the person's attention, and it's going to be what you want the person to take away with from the training.
I think you're cutting out a bit again, Ed, and I think it may be the VoIP phone rather than the microphone. He's beginning to sound like Norman Collier, says Barry. I had to say, I don't know who Norman Collier is, Barry, but I think that there is an issue there. Do you have a landline for the last 10 minutes you could dial back in on, Ed, with the code? This is it?
If you'll hang on for a minute, I will call in on that, or I can respond in the chat as well. Actually, I'll call in on landline.
Call in the landline for the moment. Barry, perhaps you can inform us while Ed's dialing back in who on earth was Norman Collier. And I'm not trying to make out I'm not old. Of course I am, but perhaps I simply am so old that I've forgotten who he was. While Ed's coming through on the line again and using, of course, the presenter dial-in, the irrelevant content thing I think is terribly important. we've also checked up, of course, on the question about evaluation data. So I just want to check whether we're looking for some specific comments and questions for Ed when he comes back online. We've got lots of comments, but I'd like some questions to throw at him as well. Just looking at some of the questions coming through. A CEO, says Jonathan, gave a dreadful presentation using dreadful clip art. We listened. Had anyone else presented, we would have stopped them. But certainly true. And I think we've all been in that position sometimes, Jonathan. Oh, yes, okay. So for those based in the UK, yeah, Norman Collier, like Freddie Starr, used to do an act where they pretended to be on a bad microphone. Yes, I do remember it now. Paul says, learning is a social activity with Ed, I think education. Hi, Ed, as a catalyst. We've all been learning from each other. Sorry, Ed, great to have you back. Paul just made a comment, Paul Taylor, that learning is a social activity with education, with Ed, as in Ed, you, as the catalyst. We've all been learning from each other. That's true. I've got an observation to make about this business of aesthetics and content, Ed. There must be a minimum level of quality which we must set ourselves as a standard before we put it in front of a user, and because otherwise it would just either give our department a bad name or it just wouldn't do the job. There must be that standard, and how would we go about setting it in our organisation, because it may be different across different places. What's the best way of doing that?
So I actually think that depends on the audience. I'll give you an example. I was back in the 90s. I was doing training for utility companies, and what we realized very quickly was that the type of graphics, the way the text was written, had to be completely different for the guys who were working inside the plant versus the operators. For the guy, and so I'm going to say that the quality of the graphics, the style of the writing, the screen layout, the font size, really depends on the audience. And this is something that's very, very difficult for the generic content vendors to do, because the guys in the plant had a much lower reading level, much shorter attention span for reading, which meant it was smaller amounts of text, more pages, bigger graphics, and is written at a much lower level. Whereas the plant operators were the other extreme. If it looked cartoonish, or if it looked, if it was more on the entertaining gaming side, they didn't take it seriously. So even though this was very similar material, we had a completely different look and feel for the two audiences. So I think your minimum level, and it's really not so much the minimum level of quality of the aesthetics. It's the most important factor for the aesthetics is who's going to be using it. Are they expecting something professional? And are they? Is it a short attention span? Do these people? What reading level do they have? And designing it that way. And this is actually a huge mistake that people make with mobile learning as well, which is they assume that the screen layout for a desktop can be transferred to a mobile device.
Absolutely. And
that's just not the case.
Yeah.
It very often, it does not work. Actually, I should say more often than not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's an approach from about 2005, that it's enough simply to boil something down, to shrink something down to a 1.5-inch screen, and that's your mobile learning done. It's actually, of course, much, much more complex than that. Andrew raised a great question, not for you necessarily, Ed, but let's have you answer it anyway. Why do senior people think they don't need presentational skills training? Actually, I think that's an interesting point there, but Ed, why do senior people think they can stand up and talk and they're usually dull as ditch water? Why is that?
This is really, really funny, and it's a good question, because I think that's this assumption that this medium or just their experience makes them a good presenter.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the point on my slide, it's talking about, not every SME is a good author, not every author is a good designer, not every designer is a good graphic artist, And people just seem to ignore the fact that each one of these skill sets is required to develop a piece of e-learning. And, not everybody is good at all of them. Yeah, it's something that I always chuckle about, and the people who usually think that they don't need training on how to be a good presenter are usually the worst presenters out there.
Absolutely, and that's what I take away from that question. I think it's a very good one, because I think actually we can turn it on ourselves. The trouble is, very often people imagine that they're good at something because they know nothing about it, which is usually what happens to senior people, which is why their presentations are so dire. My wife's point about books is the same one, actually. A lot of people imagine that to publish a book, you just need to put words on a page, which is why. And I get lots of books come across my desk which have been self-published, and they look awful because people don't realize how much there is to it. And I think we need to look at ourselves and think, well, when we are producing stuff, let's make sure, I think that this is a point well made, Ed, that there are some things we're good at, and there may be other things which we're doing, but actually we may not be very good at them. And I think your point is well made, Ed. Let's concentrate on the stuff we're good at, focus on that, and point that at the problems, rather than trying to do things which perhaps we're not so good at. Con says, mobile learning, there's a session we should have. Strange enough, Con, that's the first session in 2 weeks' time, mobile learning. Now, Jonathan Vernon says, I find that responsive web pages do translate very well. A simple example is WordPress blogs, but interactivity works too. And he's doing a master's degree exclusively on an iPad and an iPhone. Good Lord. Well, congratulations, Jonathan. Let us know when you finished it. We'd like to see the results. So, yes, Valerie says we've got October the 18th, reasons for considering mobile learning. Ed, I think we've reached the point where we've naturally wrapped up with the questions here. Unless someone's got a last question for Ed, I'm going to wrap up and take us through the housekeeping and tell you about those presentations, which I know you're eagerly awaiting in 2 weeks' time. Okay, I'm going to move the presentation to one side, and let's wrap up with my outro. LSG webinar is our hashtag. If you've enjoyed it, please tell the word about it, and if there's anything you want to share, please you can share it on LSG or contact me directly. My contact details are coming up very shortly. Yes, in answer to your question, which you haven't asked yet. Oh, are you on Twitter? Yes, Ed, could you put your Twitter handle into the box and let everybody know? That would be great. Yes, and I do echo everybody's thanks. It was a well thought out session by somebody who's been there and done it. Absolutely, thank you for that. Learning and Skills Group is where you'll find, on the webinar archive over there, highlighted on the left-hand side, is where you'll find the presentation, the recording of it, and the web chat. That will all be available there. It's free, just sign up, and you can get entry to the group. Okay, and Ed is one of these guys who prefers email to Twitter. Please contact him there. Thank you very much for putting those contact details in, Ed. And our next webinar, goodness me, look at that, 18th of October. The first one is Reasons for Considering Mobile Learning. And that's Amit Garg from India coming in for that one. And second one, Can Social Learning Succeed Alongside an LMS? That's Johanna Sadoudi coming in from France. I shall be in New York for that one, so we shall be covering probably the greatest number of time zones we ever have for these sessions. I'm just going to hope that my internet access holds up from the hotel. That's something I look forward to, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in a couple of weeks' time on the 18th of October. Thank you very much for your participation, your contribution. As always, the thinking, the thoughts, the insight make